whole plane was struggling to get into the air. Loaded beyond the margin of safety, we all knew the slightest mishap, and we'd have a crack-up and a fire. These are letters from viewers, hardly an instrument of flight, yet they provide the theme for the story you are about to see. Many of you have written to us about our stories of World War II and the present. These letters represent those of you who asked for a story about the past, the old days when every flight was a new adventure, and planes were held together by baling wire, and you know how planes were held together in those days. Well, I was there or thereabouts, and so with the aid of a few mementos I have assembled to help us out. Let us take off. It all began with glider flights. I was old enough to read about this Wright brothers gamble in 1898, but the trick would be to do it with power. I was a teenager when they turned that trick 5 years later. Everyone knows what happened at Kitty Hawk in 1903, but not everyone's seen it. Not only did the Wrights find a way of getting their four-cylindered kite into the air, but Orville, the first pilot, was able to keep it there for 12 seconds. A lot of people got very excited, but no one, including the Army, bought any airplanes. They did, however, interest men like Santos Dumont and Henry Farnham. Soon they too were gaily flapping their wings over the continent. Naturally, one inventor tried to improve on another. Count them, 14 wings, 7 on each side. This bird is really ready to go, and go she did. The creator of this motorized egg beater figured that it would get him halfway to the moon. What do you think? One blade, the moon. Then many blades, maybe even Mars. You may not believe it, but this was destined to fly. It turned out to be a better job for cutting grass. While all this wild wing-waggling was going on, however, certain officers in the Army became interested in the plane as a military weapon. A set of specifications was drawn up, and the Wrights offered an aircraft designed to meet them. I thought that you might be interested in the specifications given to the Wright brothers for that first Army airplane, and here they are. Let me read them to you. 1, it must attain a speed of 40 miles an hour. 2, it must be able to carry 2 persons. 3, it must stay in the air at least 1 hour. The last specification is of particular interest. The airplane must be capable of being disassembled and transported on an Army escort wagon. That's a wagon pulled by a team of mules. It wasn't a mule that launched the plane, however, but the tried and true catapult. The launching catapult needed more manpower than the plane had horsepower. Orville Wright was once again the pilot, and Lieutenant Benjamin Folloy his passenger. On the subsequent cross-country leg of the tests, they got all the way down to Northern Virginia and back, 10 big miles. Flying at 600 feet, they hit 42.5 miles an hour, scaring a lot of horses and exceeding the Army specifications. The Army now had an airplane, but no pilots. So in 1909, it created a table of organization. Here it is. 2 lieutenants, 1 pilot, and 1 observer. The total strength of the air arm was lost on November 5th when both men crashed the only plane. And then Europe exploded. Within 2 years, the airplane changed from a toy into a vital weapon of war. Every warring nation developed a big air force. These are Royal Air Force Sopwiths. The French had Nieuports and Spads. And they also had a rip-roaring squadron of American volunteers. Fabled Lafayette Escadrille. Air power had come of age. It all started in 1914 with observation flights over enemy positions. The opposing pilots waved greetings at each other. They didn't have any guns. Then they began taking pictures. This became annoying to the ground commanders. Even more annoying were the bombs that began to drop. It was suddenly very desirable to shoot down the enemy's planes. The machine gun was the answer. At first, fired by an observer, and then straight through their props by means of an ingenious synchronization system. The never-to-be-equaled days of the air warriors, the Knights of the Clouds, were at hand. Fighting from open cockpits at close range, they created a legend that would never be forgotten. Star battler for the Germans was the frisky Fokker. Advanced for the times with steel struts and framing, it carried such fabled aces as von Richthofen and Ernst Udet. For the Allies, the fabulous Spad was a well-built, nose-heavy job that could outdive anything on the front. The sky belonged to no man, and every day the deadly duels took place over the trenches. There were fantastic feats of flying and gunnery. Life of the fighter pilot dropped to 3 weeks, and then a new force entered the struggle, or rather it was a new lack of force. The Yanks were coming, but when the war hit, we had only 51 pilots and 68 planes. We would have had 69 of them if only this fella had managed to get into the air. But one man climbed into the wild blue with a vengeance. Eddie Rickenbacker, flying with the Hat in the Ring squadron, piled up 26 victories and became the idol of millions of American men and women. And women did more than cheer. The Rosie the Riveter of 1917 was Helen the Hemstitcher. Sewing an airplane so that it wouldn't come apart in a dive required a tough thimble finger. Our girls had it. The Kaiser had gotten fresh with them, and they were showing him how. Although built with love, the aircraft still needed engines to power it. I'd like to show you one of the engines used in the early days by the aviation section of the Signal Corps. When the war broke out, this was the standard aircraft engine in the United States. It's an old Curtiss OX. This engine developed around 80 horsepower and pushed the old Jennies along at a speed of about 80 miles an hour. This was not enough for the war, so the top engineers of the great automotive industry pooled their secrets. They soon came up with what became known as the Liberty engine. It was the greatest engineering achievement of the war. And sure enough, who did the work after the men had masterminded it? The gals, of course. It may have been a man's fight in the air, but the little ladies, trading grease for cold cream, did more than stand and wait. Once the women had finished putting them together, the men took them apart for shipping overseas. With the war reaching a climax, the American Expeditionary Force needed planes and needed them fast. So naturally, the French women obliged by putting them back together again. This isn't the way the doughboys remember the Mademoiselles, but the gals from Armentières threw a lot of well-curved muscle into getting planes ready for the big push. This was to be the greatest aerial show in history. Billy Mitchell called for 1,500 planes in the air. Their mission, to isolate the German battlefront and cut off the retreat of the enemy ground forces. It was a modern idea, but by 1918, the airplane was capable of carrying it out. I took my own ship off that morning, along with 1,480 others. It wasn't long before the Fokkers arrived to give us an argument. The enemy was fighting viciously for the air. In the great dogfights, the pilots wore no parachutes. When they were shot down, there was no escape. A lot of brave men died that day, and the days following. Both enemies and friends. One of the friends, an Arizona cowboy, Frank Luke, won the label Balloon Buster by shooting down 16 of them in 16 days. These observation jobs were well protected, and Luke finally paid for his nickname with his life. The aerial action continued week after week, and the ground forces slugged it out, yard after yard. As can be seen in these rather rare photographs, it was a tough, deadly business. Again and again, the boys went over the top, into the barbed-wired, shell-pocked no man's land. Some never even made it out of the trenches. But it paid off. They cracked the Hindenburg line and burst into open country and won the war. We flyers got a lot of decorations. That's Billy Mitchell handing out the medals. I got decorated that day along with Major Louis Brereton, whom you see here. While we got patted on the back, the world went crazy. They didn't know what lay ahead, and they didn't care. They had waited a long time for this, and they blew their tops. It was a great time for everybody except the air service, which was cut 95%. The junkyards of America became graveyards for the Falcons which had fought in France. But one man wouldn't give up. Come what might, he was determined to fly. Also determined to fly were the legendary Barnstormers. You could get a second-hand Jenny for 50 bucks, and you could make as much as 5 for a single show. To pick up this easy money, they had a variety of tricks. Even a weird assortment of parachute jumps. One of the most harrowing stunts was coming in for a landing under the carriage. No matter how you looked at it, a close scrape. These wild pilots became the glamour boys of the day. They made the public air conscious. But a lot of them didn't live long enough to enjoy it. For Lawrence Sperry, the brilliant inventor, the airplane was more than a sideshow spectacle. It was a very practical means of transportation. He used it to commute between his home and his factory. And if he happened to speed a little, the police had a tough time catching up to him. It was also an ideal vehicle for trips to such faraway places as Washington, especially since there were such excellent landing strips there. Of course, Billy Mitchell still believed that the airplane was a decisive military weapon. He sent his bombers against the once queen of the seas, the captured German battleship Ostfriesland. No one except Mitchell's air service could foresee how often this scene would be repeated in World War II. Mitchell got a lot of headlines and no appropriations. Like a poor nation, the Air Service had always been willing to try anything. In this case, it was the air mail. President Wilson came down to see the first flight off. Notice the name of the plane, the Humdinger. The pilot's navigation charts were faulty, and it turned out to be a humdinger of a flight. 22 miles outside of Washington, the mail got lost. The Air Service was in and out of the mail business for the next dozen years. There was a subsidies controversy in the early 30s. The Army pilots stepped in, flying obsolete planes through all kinds of weather, using inadequate facilities. The airmen bravely tried to do the job. It was impossible. On one Black Friday alone, 4 men were lost. But at least the public knew what it had done to its air arm. Not all Air Service projects ended tragically. This was to be coast to coast. Again, it looked like there was more manpower than horsepower. Carrying 780 gallons of extra gasoline, the plane managed to get off the ground and to make the first non-stop flight across the country. San Diego went wild. One thing for sure, looking at these pictures, the airplanes of the time didn't look any stranger than the people's outfits. This was to be a whole era of record attempts. 4 Navy planes started across the Atlantic. They managed to stay together for a while, and then 3 dropped out. One, however, the NC-4 with a stop at the Azores, made it all the way. These planes were even more ambitious. They went around the world. The Prince of Wales joined a roaring 20s crowd as it roared its approval at Floyd Bennett Field. With records being shattered everywhere, one group decided to shatter them straight up. The United States had a corner on the world helium supply and used it to good advantage. Inflation, a desirable variety in this case, took a day and a night. But it worked. Not only was a new altitude mark achieved, but crew and instruments were landed without damage. Not as much could be said for the first attempts to fly across the ocean. With the planes dangerously overloaded with gasoline, the most hazardous moment was at takeoff. You were watching the Ruth Elders plane and seeing a miracle. No one was hurt. The Spirit of St. Louis would have to face the same sort of problem. Lindbergh wagered his life that he could get off the ground. He cleared a couple of high-tension wires by 2 feet and was on his way. The Air Service now knew you could fly across the ocean, but they weren't sure how far north you could operate a military airplane. They flew in open cockpits without de-icers or heated flying suits. The crankcase oil became a solid mass, and the men suffered intensely. But they learned how flexible a weapon they really had. It was made even more flexible by aerial refueling. Routine today, it was a hazardous innovation in those days. Flying at 70 miles an hour while taking on fuel, a plane like the famous Question Mark reacted to every air current. But it was in the sky non-stop for almost 8 days. Among other records that were constantly falling were the speed marks. In 1923, at these first air races, biplanes were still king. But by 1925, the little racers had the bullet-like appearance that would evolve into the razor-wing jobs of today, and they were hitting over 200 miles an hour. Mostly these were competitions between the Army and the Navy, with the Army doing very well indeed. Top Army speed pilot was Jimmy Doolittle, and his wife was his #1 fan. Whoops. The water was supposed to be the Navy's domain. But Doolittle showed them differently, winning the coveted Snyder Cup. Through all of this time, the hard core of opinion within the Air Service held to a belief in strategic bombing, but they needed a plane that could do the job. The Barling bomber was the first attempt, the biggest plane ever built up to that time. Note the headgear on the passengers. Its 6 Liberty engines, 10 wheels, 4 tails, and 3 wings got it into the air all right and pulled it along at 90 miles an hour. It was a good plane for the time and set several records for lifting heavy loads. But the Air Service continued to seek better designs and performance. The inventor submitted this one for consideration. It outdid itself. Too bad. The Keystone bomber performed with much more competence. Even as these planes were put into service, however, the aircraft designers knew that they still had a long way to go. By the time Japan invaded Manchuria, Boeing was trying for a bomber that could outspeed a pursuit plane and outfight it beside. The B-9 didn't quite fill the bill. The B-12 Martin bomber was the fastest plane in the air, but it lacked the necessary firepower. Boeing submitted a model and blueprints for the B-17. The strapped Air Force finally gave Boeing authorization only to build a wooden mock-up of the ship and to conduct wind tunnel tests on it. The tests looked so good that Boeing took a gamble. They borrowed money and built a complete airplane. This first B-17 was an incredibly important plane. War was already threatening in Europe, and whether or not the Flying Fortress would be put into service depended on this test flight for the Army brass. That day, the Fortress crashed and burned. It looked as if Boeing had lost its gamble. An investigation went on for months. If the team could have looked into the future, they would have seen that the fate of millions of people depended on their findings. Finally, the great ship was cleared of any structural defects. Boeing got a contract for 13. The 13 became 13,000 and more. This airplane was the transition from the past to the present. The great armadas of World War II established forever the decisiveness of the air weapon. I'll be back in a moment to tell you more about the early days. Hundreds of stories and a good deal of history, amusing, dramatic, often tragic, have been left out of this little picture of the men on the planes of the past. But you asked me, and I've told you a little about the way it was, the way it really was.